Okay, we're just about ready to go. We're going to continue from where we left off last time. This is the third in a series of three, looking in on, homing in on events, or the most likely time of events. In the first talk, we talked about large sectors of life, half of life, a third of life, a quarter of life, and the 7-year periods in life. They are the same for everyone, but the accentuation is different according to the horoscopes. Those different segments in life have different rulers. In the second talk, we looked at astrological sectors, signs and houses. When progressions and transits occur in signs and houses, that's working down from a large sector of life down to 30-year periods. So you can see that as we home in on the possibility of an event, where it's like a funnel. At the lip of the funnel, things are very broad. There is no close focus. And gradually, as we work down the funnel toward the spout, we come closer and closer to a period of focus. And so what we're going to do this evening is we're going to talk about aspects, and aspects being the times when events are most likely to occur. All right. Let's begin with looking at progressions. And let's begin, as we always do, with the sun, because the sun is the most significant. It is the sun in the horoscope represents the self, both in the highest sense and in the personal ego. And self-development is what we're talking about, or why we study astrology, so we can progress and improve our selfhood as we go through life. Now, it was said in the past, and this is a little bit of a review, that each day after birth, the sun moves 1 degree on an average. And that is, it goes through 360 degrees in 365 and a quarter days. And that works out fairly closely to a degree a day. In winter, when we are closer to the sun, the orbital speed is a little bit faster, and in around midsummer, it's a little bit slower. But, you know, we can get the exact timing by looking at an ephemeris or with a computer to do calculations for us. And we've also said that each day after birth represents 1 year of life. We're talking about a symbolic kind of movement, a telescoping of events that are there in potential in the very moment of birth. So, last time we talked about orbs of influence. When is a progression felt, or when is a transit felt? And we came to the conclusion that with progressions, the orb should be about 1.5 degrees. And if we use that as an orb, there is 1.5 degrees applying and 1.5 degrees separating. So the effect of a progression, solar progression, should be about 3 years. In my own experience, I find that the influence of the separating aspect is milder than the application. That may or may not be true. That's my experience. In my experience, I can't speak for everyone. It may just be that after the height of the energy, when things have built up, things are anticlimactic. And when they're anticlimactic, there's not so much intensity as there is when you're anticipating for something. Like a child anticipating its birthday coming up ahead, it's all excited. When the birthday's over, the child's ready to go to bed and sleep. But that sort of thing holds true with progressed aspects. Now, when we looked at progressions of the inner planets, Venus and Mercury, and when we looked at them in large sectors like signs or houses, we said that they were close enough to the sun so that on average they would remain in a sign or house about the same length of time as the sun. And over an infinite amount of time, they would come out pretty closely pretty close to that. Now, we can't do that with progressed aspects, because we're dealing with a much shorter period of time. And in a short period of time, Venus or Mercury may be going quite swiftly, or it might be going slowly. So it's important to look for, when you're looking for progressions of Venus and Mercury for application and separation, to not average it out to be like the sun. The appropriate thing to do is to check out an ephemeris for the day of the progressed period that you're looking at. In fact, it's usually a pretty good idea to look at an ephemeris anyway. In fact, I look at an ephemeris every day. I'm not as good about it as I used to be, but I used to look at the newspapers and the ephemeris basically side by side so that I could see what was happening in the heavens, how that was reflected on the earth. You can do the same thing with your life. At the end of the day, you can look at the ephemeris and see what sorts of things, attitudes you had, or what kind of events came up in your life, and how that relates to what was happening with the passage of the stars by the ephemeral passage. Another planet that we use for looking at progressions is Mars. And Mars goes through 1 degree of space approximately 1.9 days. So as an estimate, it's okay to say that Mars goes through a degree of space in 2 days. This applies to 3 years separating and 3 years applying 3 years and separating 3 years. So it's double that of the sun, which is what you would expect. But just in case, it pays to look in the ephemeris anyway, because Mars is one of those planets that has an unusual orbit. I think its eccentricity is a little bit large. I remember when I was keeping a journal in the mid-60s, and the Vietnam War was ramping up. And at that time, Mars stayed in one sign for 6 or 7 or maybe even more months than that. Normally it stays in a sign a month or 2, but this was an extremely long time, and it related to all of the things that were happening with the build-up of the Vietnam War. It related to other things that were happening at that time, but that's one of the things that I was following. Now we come to the outer planets. Progressed aspects of outer planets are increasingly rare as you move outward from the sun. And not only that, they are increasingly long in their duration. I've known progressions from Jupiter to last as long as 40 years. I have a friend that has such a thing, has the or no longer does, but had the protection of a progressed Jupiter aspect for 40-some years in her life. And she came from wealth, and her wealth lasted very well through that 40-year period. And things went down after that, but you know, it's a good example. When it comes to the orbs for dynamic aspects from outer planets to natal planets, one uses the same kind of orb size as you would with inner planet progressions. You might want to tighten the orb because you're approaching the quality of a fixed star. But as always, observation is important. If you don't know whether an aspect is an orb, use observation to see. Intuition is important. Intuiting whether this is the result of that or, you know, that kind of a thing is important. If you have hunches, which some people call hunches, they really are intuitions, and learning to recognize what are true hunches and not self-flattery and that kind of thing, it's a good thing. Now, in a talk like this, we can't talk about all of the outer planet progressions. It would be too much. We would be here for hours. We're likely to be here for hours anyway. And everything I'm saying this evening is basically from my own experience and not from textbooks or from anything else. Now let's turn to transits from outer planets. So we have the progressions usually are only with inner planets, but in rare cases outer planets. But transits are best studied with outer planets because the inner planets move so swiftly that you can't keep up with them. In general, this is again from my own experience, I find that the orbs of transits are larger than the orbs of progressions. I have no idea why I think that way, but I have only my experience to go with. In practice, I use orbs of 3 degrees for outer planets. And that would mean 3 degrees applying and 3 degrees separating, or 6 degrees of space for an aspect. And for the most part, I use only conjunctions and oppositions with these kinds of transits. Even for the progressions, conjunctions and oppositions are the best to work with. When you get into progressed sextiles, you're getting into the stuff that dreams are made of, as Shakespeare would say it. All right, let's look at how long transits from outer planets last. For Pluto, the orb of a transiting conjunction or opposition would be about 5.8 years. Opposition would be a little bit longer because there are retrogrades in there. The transit of Neptune would be about 2.8 years. Quite long periods. For Uranus, it's 1.4 years, or 1 year and 5 months. For Saturn, a transit is usually felt for about 6 months. And for Jupiter, 2 months, 3 weeks. Very short period of time. Mars transits, Mars is a planet that you can use for progressions like an inner planet, and you can use it for transits like an outer planet, but the transits occur very quickly. 2 weeks, you know, a transit of Mars will be in orbit for about 2 weeks. But again, Mars has that unusual orbit, so it's very best to use an ephemeris. For my close friends that I associate with every day, I give them a new ephemeris every year for the new year, because you can't tell the players without a scorecard, as they say in the ball games. All right, when we're looking at dynamic aspects of any kind, whether they are progressions or transits, we're doing something different than what we did when we looked at sectors, whether the sectors were astrological sectors or life sectors. The dynamic transits of signs and houses are pretty constant and pretty regular. The dynamic progressions for the inner planets are also pretty much regular. Now, the quantity of aspects by progression, any dynamic way, by progression or transits, or we're going to look at some other things in a few weeks. Sometimes there are many dynamic aspects, and sometimes there are few. And the variations depend on the structure of the natal horoscope. And this is something you're going to hear again and again. Even in dynamic horoscopes, everything relates back to the natal horoscope, because the natal horoscope is the stamp of the life and things that are going to happen. So, different horoscopes have different patterns for dynamic aspects. Some people have a lot of events happening all at one time, and some people have them spread out over a long period of time. This is why, if you're working with a horoscope, it's probably, if you're going to do a lot of things with dynamic astrology, with progressions and transits, you want to know something about the person's life if you're going to be doing work with accuracy. You want to use what gamblers call the track record. You want to see how they have responded to previous incidents or analogous incidents in the past. So it varies from horoscope to horoscope. Now, it would take us too far afield at this time to go into the different patterns of in relation to dynamic things. We're going to probably do a little of that in the future, especially with regard to lunation cycles. We talked a bit about lunation cycles several talks ago, and we'll come back to that again. All right, for now, let's take stock in what we have learned in the funneling or tapering and of the dynamic atmosphere and the probability of events. To do that, let's assume a hypothetical individual with a hypothetical horoscope at a specific time of life. In any horoscope, the broadest part of the funnel are the sectors of life. Half-life, first half of life, second half of life. Aspects are, the interpretation changes whether you're in the first half of life or the second. It changes whether you're in the first third, the second third, or the third third. Now, assuming we have a good understanding of the relative strengths in planets in a natal horoscope, we can get an understanding of what the life sectors are like. And it's very broad, and it's not very focused, but that's what you expect at the lip of the funnel. Things don't really happen with the funnel until you get down into it. At the lip of it, not much is happening. It's like there are a lot of incidences in life. When you're on the lip of those incidences, you don't know whether you really care about them or whether it's important to you. But as time goes on, things become more and more important and you become more focused. Sometimes when things are looked at in the sectors, we have only a superficial understanding. What we want is more specific understanding and more specific information. We want to know what is pertinent to this person at this time. Or we want to know what times are specifically important in terms of aspects and character development. So we move away quickly from the lip of the funnel and we start working our way toward the nozzle. To do that, we bring in information from the attitude sectors and the opportunity sectors. That's what we did in the talk previous to this. We examined where the planets are in the signs and in the houses, and how swiftly by progression or transits they're going to move through those signs and houses and what it means in terms of their life. So this tells us more clearly what the attitude atmosphere is that the person is living through. If Mercury is not in the same sign and house as the Sun, the mental attitude will be very different from the self-conscious attitude because Mercury is in one sign and house and the Sun, which indicates the self, is in another sign and house. This even relates to natal horoscopes. I had a very dear friend who loved studying mysticism, but she had the mind of a scientist. And she thought like a scientist, and she didn't think like a mystic. And it was really quite. We had some very not always agreeable conversations, but we had some interesting conversations because of that. It's okay. This tells us what's in the air at this time for this person, and what one would expect. Now, to get information to move more further down the funnel toward the nozzle or the spout, to do this, we look at the dynamic aspect profile. That is, we want to look at any time in life what planets are in aspect with either by progression or by transit. The aspects are and progressions of the natal planets to the natal planets are what we're going to be looking at. The players are the planets, the natal planets and the progressed or transiting planets. And it's important to know who the players are. Like if Mercury is producing an aspect, that's someone that is a player who is activating your mind, whether in concord or in argument or something like that. That's what you're looking at. So when you're looking at the players are always indicated by the aspects. But mind you, this gets complicated because Mercury in the natal chart indicates the type of intellectual stimulators you're going to have in your life. But in the dynamic chart, Mercury might be different. You're meeting people with different ways of thinking than are normal to you, or that you had all of your life when you were with your family and things like that. So what we're dealing with here, as we work with progressions and transits, we're dealing with more and more information. And we have to keep in mind a lot more things and relate to them. Otherwise, we won't know what is going on. Now, a lot of people just want to predict aspects, and they want to predict aspects when a given planet is progressing over another one, and a third one is aspecting it by a transit. They say, oh, that's going to produce an event, and that event is going to relate to say, either the sun or Jupiter or something like that. And that's enough for them. But that's superficial. That's like wanting to see explosions and not understanding why things happen and who is involved and what this means. Like if it is something involving your natal Mercury, what it means to your mental evolution, how you learn how to think and how you grow up mentally, and always how you relate to other people. Are you struggling with them, or are you finding ways to work together with concord and things like that? So the planets, both the natal planets and the dynamic planets, tell us who the players are and what their nature is. The kind of action that takes place is what is indicated by the nature of the aspect. Now, this means a lot of information to keep it all in mind, but we're not talking about, we're not talking about something that you do and it's done quickly and that's the end of it. In earlier times, an astrologer had one client, the king and the king's family, and they knew about the king from birth. And they had all those years to study the horoscope and be very, very aware of all of these things because their life depended on it. If you made a prediction for a king, or if you missed an event for a king, that could mean your life. And so if you have only this one job, you put all of your energy and all of your time into it. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about sifting through all kinds of information and finding patterns that look like they're going to produce events. And, it looks, well, maybe Cousin Beatrice is going to pull a power play on another cousin, and then there'll be an uproar in the family, that kind of a thing. All right. We want to answer basic questions. We're trying to get to events. This is events that's the subject for tonight's talk. So when we look at the dynamic horoscope for any time or any frame of time, there are questions we want to ask. Are events likely? Good question to ask. Are events likely? Another one, if events are likely, when are they likely to occur? We want to know when. And what is the likely outcome of an event? Does it mean complete decimation, or does it mean a reformation or something like that? We want to know the likely outcome. And what will the events be like, or what will they be about? Now, these are very hard questions. Very hard questions because you have to understand life. After having lived through 86 years of it, I can't say that I really understand life that well. But I do better with it. Now, some of these are so hard, these questions are so hard, and they're made even harder because there are no absolute answers. So the best we can do is do our best and come as close to an understanding of reality as we can. All right, so for the rest of the evening, we're going to try and answer some of those questions. The first one, are events likely? Now, we partially addressed this question earlier. Now, unless there is a very well-developed and trained seer one cannot know the destiny of another. But character is destiny, and astrology delineates character. And when you have delineated character, you have an idea of the kind of destiny that person is going to have. And high points or low points in character and destiny are events. Now, even if one is not a seer, or one is not an astrologer, one always has intuition. In fact, spending as much time culturing an awareness of intuition and listening to intuition is probably as important as studying astrology. There are people in my life that I didn't study their horoscopes, but I could see that they were going to have tragic situations like horrible automobile accidents and things like that. Just from observation and intuition, you could see that there was no other way that they were going to alter or change their character or improve their being without events. Now, if you're loving and sensitive and caring, you may have intuition. If you don't have intuition, you probably shouldn't, or you don't have much intuition. Everybody has some. You don't have much intuition and you don't know how to use it, you probably shouldn't even be studying astrology, because without intuition, astrology is not very valuable. Now, if you've worked with a horoscope and an individual for a long time, you get a sense of the track record of the individual. You know, for example, this person may be a peaceable and encouraging person and a very positive person about life, but give them a drink or two and they want to fight. Those are things that, you know, that you can see. You get a track record. You say, well, that's a fun guy to be with, except if there's drinking involved, you want to be around that sort of thing. So with intuition and experience, we come to some rough guidelines. And let's look at rough guidelines. One of them is that if transits, if the natal and the progressed planets are strong, events are more likely. That is to say, if a planet in your natal horoscope is really weak, it's not likely to produce events. And if another weak or mediocre strength planet aspects it, it's not likely to produce an event. If there are strong planets in strong conditions, and there are strong planets doing the transiting or progression, then you can get events. I find that transits in themselves are less likely to precipitate events, at least not important events. They do sometimes, but they do a lot to augment. They might be secondary events that come out of a primary event. If you think of it like a bowling alley, you strike the kingpin, and the kingpin gets knocked over, and it knocks over some other ones, and some of them knock over one way on the other side of the alley, and that's sort of the way events work. That there are secondary events, like that pin on the side of the alley. If there are several progressions active at the same time, that is, simultaneously, even if they are not at culmination, events in any one of them is more likely. That is to say, if suppose there are progressions to, I don't know, maybe Venus in one part of the horoscope and Uranus in another part of the horoscope and yet a third progression somewhere else, because there are three progressions active at the same time, it's much more likely that events will happen in one, even if those three planets are not connected. It's sort of like it sets up a field of vulnerability. It sets up a field of dynamic sensitivity that things could take place. This is a thing in dynamic astrology. Multiplicity increases the likelihood of events, and if there are events, it likely increases the intensity of them. But even more than multiplicity, if there is redundancy in the multiplicity, there certainly it'll be much more likely to have events and significant events and strong events. All right, those are some basic guidelines, especially the ones about multiplicity and about redundancy. Let's ask the next question. If there are events, what will they be? Often the circumstances of life make this unnecessary. This type of question you don't even have to ask sometimes. There is an important rule in forecasting and predicting, and that is everything goes back to the natal horoscope. Everything refers back to the natal horoscope. Most events are not surprises, either astrologically or in terms of life. If you know somebody's fooling around with somebody else's wife, you can predict there's going to be an event. Things like that just don't stay, what the heart feels has to come out, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. You can see, suppose this person is smoking, and they're smoking maybe 3 packs a day or something like that. You can predict that something like lung cancer is a likelihood. You see some progress aspects coming up in Gemini. You have, by looking at life, you have a pretty good idea of what they mean. Emphysema at least. Now, events usually happen in some sort of season. The last time we met, we were talking about astrological seasons. Seasons governed by signs and seasons governed by houses. Seasons of attitude and seasons of opportunities. So every event or all events are going to happen in some sort of season. Like most illnesses occur when a person is run down physically. A specific illness is an event. Taking a period of time and allowing yourself to be run down physically, that's a season. And that's the kind of thing that you look for. You don't look for a promotion at work if you haven't been performing well, if you haven't been doing your job right, and you've been lackadaisical. You can't expect that you're going to have an event that is a promotion. And your performance over a period of time is a season, and that season indicates it's going to have things that it's going to have consequences. Now, even so, accidents occur, but you would think that there are no accidents. That's probably right. All things are a matter of destiny. But if a person is careless, and if a person is not paying attention, that is a season, that's perhaps a lifelong season of an accident happening. All right, so everything refers back to the natal horoscope. The principle involved in this is, before looking to astrology, observe. Observe. You know, people are not going to come to you and say, what's happening in my life? People are going to come to you and say, this is happening in my life, what can I do? And so you want to observe the person and get as much information as you can. Ask a lot of questions. Get as much of a sense of what's going on before you even look at the horoscope. And then when you work with the horoscope tells you where to look and what kind of questions to ask to have even better empirical data to work from. Look at the conditions of the life of a person. Black lung happens to coal miners. It doesn't happen to lumberjacks. And that's something you expect. A lot of people would like to be clairvoyant. My teacher was both clairvoyant and an excellent astrologer, but asked which one he would choose if he had to sacrifice one or the other. He said he would sacrifice the clairvoyance because there are things with astrology that he found so useful and so much more helpful for understanding situations. But the two have to work together. I think astrology is just a stopgap until we do have a higher vision that can take in much more. I'm talking about a distant future. I'm not talking about a lightweight clairvoyance. But clairvoyance is just, the word literally means clear vision, and it's just an extension of observation. If you're observing clearly, and if you are seeing things, you begin to see into the causes of them. It's astounding what can be done with observation. I don't know if you've ever read any of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the Arthur Conan Doyle hero that was a detective that had amazing powers of observation. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle was involved with mysticism, and he even worked with trance mediums and things like that. So the whole idea of clairvoyance was something that was in his mind. But Sherlock Holmes is based on a true individual. There was a man that could tell by looking at the calluses on your hand the kind of work that you did, and he could conclude with amazing detail many of the circumstances of your life just from simple observation and intuitively deducing what you're getting from that observation. So that's something that we're wanting to do. We're wanting to get to that place. Okay, when we're looking at things, there is an old adage that applies to astrology when we're doing this kind of observation. It goes something like, one doesn't expect to harvest tomatoes if one has planted cabbage. The tomatoes are going to come from tomato plants. So you want to observe and observe clearly. The natal horoscope is what is most likely to determine ripeness. Earlier we said that stronger planets were more likely to have aspects that produced events, or events that came out of aspects. That's what we're saying now. We're saying the same thing in other words. A strong planet in a horoscope is something that someone has worked on very hard in the past, probably in a past life, or probably even several lives. And that is what is likely to be brought to culmination. That ripeness is a matter of bringing something to fruition by work. Everything has its time built right into it. And as far as tomatoes and cabbages are concerned, you don't expect Saturnian consequences if you're working with Jupiter. So basically, again, it pays to do a comprehensive study of the natal horoscope with regard to progressions, transits, with regard to events and periods of life. And that comprehensive study is important. When you do that, even indirect rulers, the house, everybody looks at the house and sign that a planet is in, and they don't look at the house and sign that the planet rules, which is something very different, and so they're missing half of astrology. William Lilly, who studied astrology as much as 13 hours a day, did that very much. If you read his book, which is called Practical Astrology, A Christian Approach, he did that. He did really amazing things. So you want to understand character, because destiny is the expression of character. And if you understand the character of the individual, you're much more likely to be able to forecast what's happening to them and to predict times that are important. It's wonderful what happens along the way in our lives, but it's only a result of our character. If we didn't have a certain character, those things wouldn't happen. Most things that happen in a person's life are unique to them. Even if the same kind of event happens to two people, it's going to mean two different things, because each individual is unique, and each individual gives something to an event and takes something from an event. It can't be any other way. All right. I guess what I'm trying to say is you have to learn to think astrologically. It's not, like learning to read when you were in grade school. You put the words together and see, spot, run, and that sort of thing, yes. But when you're dealing with astrological thinking, you're understanding and wondering how a person in their consciousness functions, and how that functioning is a mirror of what happens in the heaven. It's like what you're doing with the paints of character, and the paints are what are indicated by the planets. All right. Now, some people choose not to use astrology because astrology seems to them indirect. Why learn astrology when you can just learn people and come to an understanding in that way? I can understand that. There are times that I almost wish I didn't study astrology. Not too often, but occasionally that does happen. All right. We're going awfully slowly here. Now it's time to try to answer the terribly difficult question: if there is to be an event, when will it occur? We've decided that the likelihood of events depends on strength of planets and a logical character development. But when is it likely to occur? That's a very difficult thing. And part of the difficulty is there is no standard way in which events occur from the study of astrology. There are many ways that events are brought to pass. Not just one simple standard way, but many ways. And there are so many potential factors, many factors that could bring an event about. So what we're going to do now for the next few minutes is look at some of the most common ways that events come about from my personal experience. We've already stated several things, and there are more than what we have stated. Let's do some review and clarification. An event is likely if a strong planet is undergoing a progression, especially if the planet is the sun, and especially if the progressing planet is the sun. So the principle is an event is likely if a strong planet is undergoing a progression. An event is more likely if the progressed aspect is applying or at culmination, and not so likely if there is separation. So if a progressed aspect, again, if it's a strong planet being progressed by a strong planet, it's more likely to happen during the application or the culmination of that event. An event is even more likely if there is another progression anywhere else in the horoscope. It is like it sets up a field of likelihood. And if we're talking about a life event, there usually are other background events. It isn't just whether you're going to get a raise at work. It's about whether your focus is good because there's something going on the home front with one of your children causing a lot of problems or something like that, making it more difficult for you to focus on your work life. The two things would be the applying for a promotion or a raise or something like that would be indicated by one progression. But dealing with a problem child would be by another progression. Now, that's one simple example of how two progressions active at the same time are more likely to produce an event. An event is even more likely if the other progression is similar in character to the first. Suppose, again, let's try to work with that same example. Suppose you're looking for a raise or a promotion at work, and that's indicated by one aspect. But suppose at the same time there is another progression that is about a competitive spirit, and you have a rival for that promotion that you're looking for. So those two aspects, progressions, are focusing on the same thing, and that makes it all the more likely that there is going to be an event. See, astrology is not some hocus-pocus mystery thing out in the heavens. Astrology reflects what's going on in life. And if you can recognize who the players are, or you can recognize the forces that are in focus or being brought into play, it's easier to understand it. It's easier to work things out. And an event is even more likely if the other progression is of a similar character, because there's a redundancy. And there's even more likelihood if the same planet being progressed on is in another aspect. That is to say, there is another progression to the same planet, even though it's very vague, and even though it might even be just a transit. But if there are several planets, several astrological activities focused on the same planet, and the primary one of them is a progressed aspect, that greatly enlarges the likelihood of an event taking place. An event is likely if the progressing planet aspects the planet natally. That is to say, suppose Mercury in a natal horoscope is conjoined, I don't know, to Venus. And then suppose that the progressed Mercury is sextile, or better yet, square, something common, square to Venus. That progressed aspect is to the same planet that there's a natal aspect to. And that says you already have something working with that. And this is just a fulfillment of that same thing. An event is more likely if there is an outer planet transit of any time, of any kind, as a progression is forming. So suppose the Sun is coming to a progressed conjunction of Saturn. If there's a transit in the air at the same time, there's a greater likelihood of an event taking place. But you have to remember that the progression is something that a person is working out from within. If the Sun is coming to a square Saturn, it's a matter of self-doubt. But if there is a transit of any kind out there, that is something that's in the atmosphere. It might be a societal thing, it might be a political shift, or it might be an economic depression, or it might be an artistic fad or something like that. But the presence of that transit indicates that what is being worked out from within by the progression is more likely to occur and result in an event. An event is even more likely if the transit is to the same planet that the progression is to. So if the Sun by progression is square to Saturn or coming conjoined to Saturn, at the same time Neptune is by transit opposing Saturn, that's very likely to produce an event that sends you to the pharmacist for an antidepressant or something like that. All right. Transits can, but rarely do, produce events on their own. All right. We've given snippets of examples, but now let's try to do a little bit better example. It's still going to be sketchy because the factors in something like this mount very rapidly. All right, suppose the Sun progressed, is coming to an aspect at a natal Jupiter. The Sun is the activator. So this is something that is coming from ego development, from self-development, spiritual self-development. Since Jupiter is positive and expressive, this would be a 3-year period that you'd be riding high. Even if you were overdoing, it would still be riding high, and it would still be your self-image would be very much bolstered, even if it was a false self-image, like the sun was squaring Jupiter. Then the natal sun indicates the state of self-development in the individual. The progressed sun indicates what is being applied now in order to undergo this positive embellishment or advancement of selfhood. The natal sun indicates what the self-image was at birth. If the self-image at birth was timid, this could mark a period of coming out of timidity. Or if the self was, somebody was very strongly self-centered, this would indicate a fulfillment of that. This would say, no, I've waited all my life, I can do this now. Now this is important because this person is being bolstered. You know, self-improvement is not going to come out of nowhere. It's a continuation of something that's been going on before. Our whole life is, we're spiritual beings. And as spiritual beings, we continue on. And life here is one phase or one operation of self-improvement or of creation or of doing something for the universe. And then we go into another. It's a continuum. It's really important to understand that. If either the sun or Jupiter is strong in the natal, this is important because it's likely to produce an event. Solar progressions are likely to produce events and be important in any case because the self is most important. So if you look at all the different progressions that there are, the solar progressions are usually the ones that are most likely to produce events, except if there's something really strong here, something like that. You get what I'm saying. If the progressed aspect is malefic, such as a square or opposition, the period and event would likely to have some success of perhaps overdoing or overconfidence or carelessness. The degree of excess or the degree of overdoing depend on the natal sun and the natal Jupiter. You always refer back to see, some people are just not likely to go overboard on something. I have to be careful of things like that. The natal sun, if they did something like a trine to natal Saturn, that would indicate somebody that was pretty much modest. And this Jupiter progression would indicate a modest outpouring of self. This is not somebody that's going to become an MC for the before millions of people. Now, if the natal sun was something like opposite to the natal moon, that indicates irregularity and uncertainty. And this might indicate a rather jerky kind of expansiveness. One day, very outgoing, and then the next maybe not so much, and a little bit of hesitancy in there. If the Jupiter natally aspected Mercury natally, there would likely be a lot of verbalism in all of this. Person would become very talkative. Not only were they bursting out with a positive self-image, but they would want to talk about it, and they could be quite voluble about it all. So you can see in all of these things, we've only looked at a very few of the potential factors. We haven't looked at signs or house positions or dispositions or depositions or all of those astrological things. You can see already how much the factors multiply. Now, in many cases, you're not going to be called on to do that. But if you're an astrologer to the king, you are going to be called on. Now suppose that simultaneously there is another progression active. Say the progressed Mars is forming a progressed aspect to the natal Venus. Aha, we bring in a romantic situation. Now we could go through the same kind of list of probabilities that we did when we looked at the progression of the Sun to Jupiter. We could do that. And even in the abbreviated form that we've done in this talk, it would still be too much. We're talking about a lot of information. An event doesn't come out of, it is just a simple thing. So there may or may not be a connection between the two progressed aspects. The easiest and the best way to find out if there's a connection, you can do it astrologically, but sometimes that gets very complicated, and there are formulae for doing that sort of thing. But the easiest way is to look by observation. Is there a romance, or are there feelings of love or cherishing or sexuality or something like that in the air? And if you see that, and then you can see how that affects whether the person is exercising good judgment in the expansive Jupiter aspects. So I don't know. I want to cut back because I think I've gotten the idea across that there are many factors. And some of these factors are more important than the others. And you can tell that by weighing things and by estimations and things of that nature. It doesn't pay to go into dynamic astrology if you don't know natal astrology really well. And I have a series of 3 or 4 courses before this, before coming to dynamic astrology, so you know all of these things inside out, so that you're ready to tackle the complications of dynamic astrology. So I'm wanting to cut this short because it's too much. It's too much for somebody's just tuning in for a casual looking. A nice way to spend Thursday night is to tune in and get swamped with too much information. But let's do a little bit more. All right. Now suppose there's an outer planet transit, and that is to some natal planet, and it occurs during this 3-year period. We could again go through a whole long list of probabilities, but the thing we would have to realize is that from the transit, it indicates something in the outer atmosphere, not so much from the inner atmosphere. The outer atmosphere in the world, because the transits are what's happening in the world right now, how that impinges on what's happening inwardly. You have to adjust yourself to the external climate. Again, now we could go through all of this again, and we could get into all sorts of things that are involved in a situation. But let's just pick out of what we've looked at for the last few minutes, let's just pick out a few criteria for indicating the likelihood of an event. It should be pointed out that transits span the entire 3-year period sometimes. Remember, we said that about the Pluto planet. The Pluto transit might last a number of years, a good number of years, and it would be in effect before this small period of progression took place, and it would be present after it was over by a few years. I don't know how much I want to go into relating an internal crisis to an external crisis, but let's just say we've slid down the funnel a bit by looking at progressions and their likelihood to be productive of events. We've done that much. And we've slid down a little further by increasing the likelihood of an event by seeing what was in the air from the transits, what was present externally. What has been missing from what we've said is when are the events most likely to occur. We have seen things that are likely to produce events and what the flavor of those events are likely to be and what factors, when they're stronger or weaker, are more likely to produce events, but it hasn't told us yet when those events are likely to occur. And this is what everybody wants to know. Well, how do I predict an event? You're going to be disappointed. Maybe not. Now, in all that we have been speaking of during this talk so far, we have been missing something very important: the moon. If you remember, in fairly recent talks in this series, we spent a considerable amount of time talking about the moon. We spent an entire talk speaking about the lunation cycle. And we've talked about cycles of lunations and eclipses. That was another talk. And the reason for all of this is that in all of the almost all of the systems of prediction, the moon is important in locating when events are going to occur. Some say that progressions are like an hour hand and transits are like a minute hand on a clock, and the moon is like a second hand. The moon is most likely to be at the nozzle of the funnel, right at the spout. I use the word likely because I can say this again and again, there are no absolute answers about the timing of, or the astrological prediction of the timing of an event. So we have to ask some enigmatic questions about the moon. The moon is active in the dynamic chart in various ways, and each of those ways has an effect. The moon has always been a reflector of the wishes of the sun. The moon has been also seen traditionally as the hunter in terms of events. It hunts down the animals in the zodiac. Zodiac means circle of animals. The moon has also been seen as the materializer or the crystallizer. It rules the whole period of the fetus in the womb. That's all ruled by the moon. So that whole process of materializing or crystallizing is that of an activity of the moon. So to answer the question, which moon, for those who view the moon as the second hand, is it the progressed moon? The progressed moon goes around the zodiac every 28 years. And we have pointed out that from the conception, the moon has been involved in the birth, growth, and development of each of our inner bodies during those 7 years climacterices. The progressed moon progresses through 1/4 of the zodiac, 1/4 of the zodiac every 7 years. So the 1/4 of the zodiac is part of a square, and the square, or the number 4, is the number of building. So we're seeing that the progressed moon affects the whole process in many ways. That we talked about the 7-year climateracies. This means that we have every planet stimulated in the horoscope and dynamic horoscope every 7 years, because in 90 degrees no planet can be left out. Now, at the time that the progressed moon over this 28-year period aspects the natal and dynamic planets, events are more likely to occur, especially if we have all the conditions that we have talked about earlier. They have set everything up so that when the moon comes along, it finalizes. It trips the last switch for things to come out. So this is the thesis of the progressed moon as the spigot at the very end of the funnel. Well, let's try to demonstrate it with a partial example. Let's take our example, the progressed moon conjoined to natal Jupiter. To raise the likelihood, we said that the progressed Mars was forming an aspect with the natal Venus. And to raise the likelihood even higher, we said there is a likely an outer planet transit. Say, for example, Neptune transiting natal Mercury. And then to raise the likelihood even greater, to a transit to Jupiter, say Saturn transiting natal Jupiter. Now we could have raised the likelihood even higher if there had been a solar eclipse, and the solar eclipse affected one of the planets involved in all of the above. According to this thesis, if the progressed moon formed either a conjunction or opposition to the natal Jupiter, which it'll do one of each in a 28-year period, it would at that time, there would be an event. The sector of life, whether we were in the first third of life or in the climaterics, the 14-year or 21-year, would give us an understanding of what that event meant in the character development of the human being when you see the whole life as a creative event, like the life of a flower beginning with a seed and coming to a stem and then to a flower and then back to a seed. We would see how that worked. This event worked into that. So we have a rough idea of the thesis of the progressed moon as the generator of events. So the question you honestly want to ask yourself is, does this work? You could ask it another way. Is this when events occur? And my answer to that is sometimes. At best, usually. There are no absolutes when it comes to predictive astrology. If you get it, the only absolute is intuition. If you say, does that work in this case? If the intuition says yes, go for it. That's, there are no absolutes. There are other factors that may increase the likelihood. You could bring in fixed stars, or you could bring in Arabic points or Arabic parts, or you could bring in harmonics. And astrologers bring in all sorts of technicalities. If you think this talk this evening is technical, this is baby stuff compared to what some astrologers get into things that are, I salute them for their willingness to work, but their relevance to life itself, I have questions about that. All right, but even with all of these techniques, there are still no absolutes. Maybe we're not at the very tip of the funnel. There's always the transiting moon. The moon transits the zodiac every 28 days. Therefore, the moon forms a conjunction or an opposition with every planet, once a month a conjunction and once a month an opposition. So those are also likely times. So when the moon transits the Jupiter, that could produce an event, whether the progressed moon is there or not. If the progressed moon is there and the transiting moon is there, you would think it is a lead pipe cinch. Sometimes it seems it is, but there are no absolutes. So the question would be, does this produce an event? Sometimes. It would certainly be much more likely. I have seen renowned astrologers fall on their face. There are, I don't know if it's still on or not, but there used to be an all-night radio show that went into all sorts of things, everything from Bigfoot to what's happening in the space program to psychic and spiritual things. And one time they had a man on there called, I won't say his name, but he made predictions. He was an astrologer. And every one of his predictions came true. And the host of the radio show was really impressed with him, and he did what they always do. Can you make more predictions? And he made more predictions. And I could see with the first predictions that he got right, I could see what he was basing it on astrologically. And then when he made his new predictions, I looked things up in the ephemeris, and I could see what he was basing. He was doing it all with ephemeral astrology. And I could see what he was basing it on. And the days of his predictions came and went with no events that he had predicted. And that was the end of his career of being on an all-night talk show. And this is not laughing at him. This is just to say how difficult this really is. Unless you have intuition, you can have a lot of astrological knowledge, and you can go into extreme detail like this isn't even extreme. And you can get things right with a probability, but it only sometimes. The only thing that is really sure is if there is intuitive knowledge. And intuitive knowledge, as far as I'm concerned, is not there for the vanity of making predictions and to have a national reputation or anything of that nature. Intuition is there because you love and you care for other people, and you want to help them, and you want to improve things in their life, and you want them to make steps forward in their own development. That is what is important. And then intuition is more likely to speak. You don't have intuitions about complete strangers that mean nothing to you. You don't have intuitions about, you can, but they're not as likely. It's when you have people you love, you can say, intuitively you know they're making a mistake, and you try to gently help them if you can. All right, so if the transiting moon is not at the tip of the spout, is there something else more than can you get further to the tip of the spout than the transiting moon? And the answer to that is possibly. Not certainly, but possibly. I have seen all sorts of final triggers. I have seen things from the transiting Mercury or the transiting Venus or things like that, all little that bring it down to the final second. Destiny is so perfect that it brings in exactly the right flavors at exactly the right times. But we don't have that kind of consciousness. And so, yes, there are other things that might be more at the tip of the funnel than the transiting moon. Now, we've been just dealing with very simple things. We've been dealing with a progression, and then a transit, and then maybe an eclipse, and then bringing it down to one simple trigger. But maybe that's not it. I have seen, especially when it comes to natural phenomena, like when you try to predict earthquakes or blizzards or something like that, you'll come to a trigger, but that is an intermediary trigger. And then you follow along the same gestalt that's in the air, and then there is a secondary trigger, and sometimes there are tertiary or quaternary triggers that before an event takes place. There have been astrological studies of the largest recorded volcanic explosion of Krakatoa, and the astrological study of that is beautiful. They show a setup and then how of an eclipse, and then how something set up something more, and another astronomical event set up something more, and then there was the final trigger to bring things out. So there are multiple trigger events. You don't find them so much in human horoscopes as you do in natural phenomena. All right, we have one more question to answer. And of the questions we set before us, and that question is, what is the likely outcome of an event? Again, we return to fundamental principles. Know the people. Get to know the people. John Steinbeck talks, I don't know if it's in Grapes of Wrath or in East of Eden, but he talks about a doctor and how this doctor marvels how someone in the prime of life, looking vigorous, robust, and healthy, will succumb to a disease where somebody else who is scrawny and looks like they're not going to last another month goes through the ravages of the same disease and comes out perfectly fine. There is something in the character of people that they can withstand difficult circumstances and they thrive on them. So it's important, again, use the observation and get to know people and how they deal with difficult things. You can use the horoscope in that, but get to know the people to understand, I'll tell you, I very rarely make predictions from people's horoscopes. Very rarely, because a lot of people cannot handle it. And if you are doing astrological work, there is something of a mystique about that, even though there shouldn't be. And people weigh what you say, they give it more credence than it probably deserves. And if you start making predictions, you're setting up a condition for a person to expect things to happen a certain way or not. And that's not a good thing to do. you're then entering into another person's destiny. You're not just commenting on what is happening astrologically. You're entering into their life. And I've rarely ever make predictions. It's just not a healthy thing to do. But at any rate, different people respond to things differently. Some people are very resilient. Some people are likely to parlay positives. One thing happens and they use that as a means to spring even further in a positive direction. The same thing, you can put somebody into a negative down spiral. Those things all are important. This is why, again, have a track record. All right, now let's try to answer the question, what is the likely outcome of an event? Astrologically speaking, the question is answered more by the natal horoscope than the dynamic horoscope. If the general natal horoscope has a positive outlook, the outcome is more likely to be positive, or there's more likely to be a silver lining even if it isn't positive, no matter what happens in the dynamic. If a person has that kind of positivity, they can go a long way. But you have to be careful. You have to know whether it's a true positive or a false positive. There are people that are over-optimistic that are not really optimistic. All right. If the natal horoscope is basically negative, even a benefice will be squandered. Now the same thing is true of the specific, which is the progression in question. I'm not going to go back to that same example that we've been using all along, but I'm going to take 4 basic cases that are very simple, and from them you get the feeling of what's going on. Suppose the natal planet is heavily afflicted, indicating a bad attitude or a bad habit or something like that. And then if the dynamic is also afflictive, this could be catastrophic. If a person is depressive and an event happened that is likely to cause depression, this could put them really in a down spiral. Then suppose the natal planet is afflicted, but the dynamic planet is positive. And that could have various outcomes. It could be like a wasted opportunity because a person is so negative in their consciousness that they don't see what they can get out of it. Or it could just mean a respite, a relief for a life that is normally downhill. All right. The third case, suppose the natal planet is benefically aspected, but the dynamic is afflicted. That's a necessary trial. Sometimes we have trials and we become stronger through them. Yes, we may get a wound and a scar from it, but we're still, because our basic nature is positive, we'll still come out of it to the positive. It's a temporary setback or something like that. And of course, the final case is if there is a benefic natal planet and it is, through progressions and transits and things like that, affected very benefically, there's only one answer. The sky's the limit. Not exactly that extreme, but this is something that's, Somebody may have worked for lives to set up a situation like this, that they can carry something out to great perfection and to great beauty. All right. These are just extremes. And what you're going to run into in almost all cases are mixes where all kinds of positives and negatives mixed together. And it's called judicial astrology because you have to judge, you have to weigh a lot of factors and judge to see what works and what doesn't work, or what's true and what isn't true. Now remember, these are just extremes. Now, if there is time for me, I'll try to get some examples of the funnel. We already had the examples from my life showing the effects of progressions and transits and how they came down to events, but I didn't do the whole funnel with them. But you can go back to those and you can see that there was something there. Now, the big lesson from all of this is that character development and character growth is more important. We've looked at a lot of astrology tonight and a lot of the possibilities of astrology, but astrology is to help people build character. You can play astrology and it's a big trap. I've seen people get trapped into playing cards because each hand was a new life and it was a new drama, but to what purpose? And to look at a horoscope and be fascinated by this and that, it's a wonderful thing, but to what purpose? We're dealing with character building and how that takes place in a person's life, and that is what is important. And astrology is only benefic if it is helpful to that process. We're trying to help people become of better character. All right. Thank you very much.